Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. Where are you watching from? Today we'll go into the shadows of North America's oldest mountains to find two young women who broke all the rules of society and left a mark that historians would rather forget. In the mountains of West Virginia, people told stories about two rebellious women named Lillian and Grace. The year is 1923. Prohibition is in full swing, changing turning the United States into a country full of lies. There are speakeasies and jazz clubs in big cities, but the Appalachians have their own rules and secrets. This is the place where our story starts. In McDowell County, in southern West Virginia, which is known for its rough terrain, there are coal mines, people who live alone, and a deep silence that comes from the tunnels that cut through the mountains. When Lillian May Hartley was 18, she made up her mind that she would not be one of the many women locked up in the wooden huts spread out across the hills. They lived a life of slavery. She grew up in a mining family, so she knew all too well the sound of lungs being torn apart by coal dust and the smell of sweat and despair that filled that harsh male world. But Lillian's eyes had something else, a dangerous spark that made her refuse to accept the fate she was born with. Her wild friend was Grace Elelina Whitmore. Also 18, Grace came from a slightly better-off family that ran a small store in Welch, largest town in the county. But in the Appalachians at that time, wealth isn't everything. It wasn't free to have a metal roof instead of a wood one. It didn't mean pick, and Grace, like Lillian, could feel the unseen chains that held all the women in that area in a small, suffocating role. They met at one of the Welch Methodist Church's few neighborhood dances. When their eyes met, everything would change. Witnesses told us what was said that June night in 1922, but we don't know for sure. Years later, it was said that the two talked for hours in a corner of the hall while everyone else danced to the sound of a violin that wasn't tuned right and a sad harp. There was a shape made. Two souls who saw in each other a desire for something bigger and more impossible made a secret deal to work together. The months that followed were full of secret talks. Lillian and Grace met on mountain trails that not many people use, away from their parents and brothers. And friends. A lot of time spent together by two young women at that time and place was already talked about. But the Appalachians have always been very good at keeping their secrets. The mountains are also very big, so there are lots of places to hide for hours without anyone noticing. The plan started to take shape during these talks. They didn't leave any written records for us. There are no diaries to be found. Even though the letters are gone, the events that happened afterward speak for themselves. Lucy and Grace They were working on a big project that would set them free from the world of coal and slavery for good. This project would put them on a train track going somewhere else. It had to do with money. It is always that way. There were two young women who didn't have any money, skills that were valued in the real world, or any formal schooling beyond the basics. You only had dreams and bravery, so how could you get away? The answer came from somewhere you wouldn't expect it. The Whitmore store, which was owned by Grace's family, also. Things, but also the mine's money. At that time, many shops were also informal banks where men could keep their wages until they were ready to spend them on gambling or drinking. Something took place at the Whitmore store on September 23, 1923. Not much is known about what happened, but we do know that someone broke into the store that night while the family slept upstairs and stole a lot of money. According to county records, the amount is $840. That much money for that time and place. They also took a 38mm gun. The gun was kept under the counter. The next morning, when Grace's dad went downstairs to open the store, the door was open from the inside. The safe opened with the right combination, but his daughter was not inside. Also, Lillian had left the house in the middle of the night. It was too clear to ignore the link. Everyone in the neighborhood was shocked by the note that was left on the empty counter. A note in Grace's neat handwriting with only 5 words that would have made any father's blood run cold. That time, do not follow us. The news quickly spread through the mountains. 2 young women ran away with a gun and stolen money. People were talking about the incident in secret on Welch's porches and on street corners. Not only the theft shocked everyone, but also the brazenness, the coldness, and the careful planning. This wasn't something that was done on the spot. It was a call to fight against everything that people thought was important. Police chief of McDowell County, a man named Thomas. Brennan was called right away. Brennan was 52 years old and had dealt with bootleggers, miners' feuds, and the odd crime of passion for many years. But this wasn't like that. There was no sign of the 2 young women who went missing in the woods. Brennan was determined to find them before something worse happened. They needed a way to get there, a place to stay, and a plan. The train stations were the main focus of the first searches. Welch was connected by train to Norfolk and other bigger cities in Virginia. At first, people thought Lillian and Grace had taken the overnight train that left at 3 a.m., but the accounts didn't sound like the train. That night, no young women had bought tickets. No women going alone or with a partner were seen getting on the plane. The first scary reports came out around that time. A farmer who lived about 10 miles north of Welch said she saw 2 women walking along the dirt road toward Bluefield early that September 24th. They walked with bundles on. They walked quickly, almost like they were running, on their backs. When he offered to take them on a ride in his wagon, they kindly but firmly turned him down and went off down a side trail that led into the more dense mountains. Bluefield was a bigger town on the line between West Virginia and Virginia. In that spot, 2 young women could talk to each other more freely and not be asked as many questions. Sheriff Brennan put together a small group and went there, getting there on September 26th. Even so, Bluefield was already packed. It comes with its own issues. The town was full of people who worked in the mines, broke the law by selling alcohol, traveled, and went on adventures of all kinds. It would be like looking for a needle in a haystack to find 2 young women there. At the same time, something strange started to happen. Letters started to come to Welch. These letters were not like any other. They were secret messages that were clearly written by Grace or Lillian, but were never signed. The first one came on October 1st and was sent to the Welch Daily News, a local newspaper. The editor was shocked and printed excerpts in the same day's issue. The letter said, "You taught us that women should be quiet, obey, and invisible. We learned our lesson well. We learned to be invisible, but now we use that invisibility for our own purposes. Look for us in the places where no one looks. Look for us in the shadows you made." The message was poetic, almost too literary for young women with only a basic education. But those words were very smart. They showed that they knew what they were talking about. It was no longer just a case of running away. They had turned into signs. After a week, the second letter came. This time, it was written straight to Grace's dad. The words were more personal, but they were just as hard. "The money we took came from the hard work of men whose lungs will fail them young, so they will never see their children grow up. We just went ahead and spent that money on something more important. Our freedom. Don't feel bad for us. Feel jealous, the careless brutality in those lines." The group was split up. Some people saw the young women as thieves who had no shame. Some people, mostly younger women, started to see them as heroes. Sheriff Brennan was very angry. Those letters made fun of law and order, as well as everything he stood for. Still, there was something interesting about them. Each letter was sent from a different spot. The first one was sent from Charleston, West Virginia City. Someone from Roanoke, Virginia sent the second one. They were always moving and never stayed put for long enough to be grabbed. And most amazingly, they were still alive. However, even though she was careful with her money, $840 didn't last forever. What the investigation showed was very upsetting. Small thefts were being reported in towns along the path that went through West Virginia, Virginia, and Kentucky. Supply shops, small warehouses, and even homes in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing big. It was all small amounts and things. But there was a pattern. The thefts always took place at night. There was never any anger, and they left something behind every time. There was a small mark on the wall or door that would become her identity. Two rocks that are tangled together almost look like a heart. In the news, the case was called the Robber Maidens of Appalachia. Some stories tried to get people's attention by making them seem like dangerous criminals. Some people, especially in smaller, more liberal publications, saw them as a female Robin Hood who stole from retailers and gave the poorest people more power and choices. In late. Something happened in October 1923 that changed everything. A small town called Abington is in the southwestern part of Virginia. Two young women went into a gun shop. The owner, a guy named Ezekiel Morton, said. They asked about magazine loads for a .38 caliber handgun and were polite and well-dressed. Morton sold the bullets without questioning them because he had not heard of the case or made the link. The mistake he made wasn't clear to him until he saw a wanted sign that had come in the mail. The descriptions were a great match. Hi, Lillian. She is about normal height, has light brown hair that is usually pulled back in a bun, light eyes, and a small scar on her left eyebrow. Grace is a little taller, has dark blonde hair, light eyes, and a smile that is easy to steal your heart. The fact that they bought more bullets showed that they still had the gun and were ready to use it if they had to. Early in 1923, winter came. By the middle of November, snow covered the Appalachians, and dirt roads turned into frozen slush that made it hard to get around. This is what Sheriff Brennan and his team will do. Meant that the chase had to stop. What winter did for Lillian and Grace, though, was even worse. It took more than guts to stay alive in the mountains that season. You needed to know what you were doing, be patient, and have a lot of luck. More and more reports of the two young women stopped coming in during those cold months. Sometimes a tourist would say that they saw two women in a remote tavern or camping near a side trail, but by the time the police got there, the women were gone again. It looked like in those old mountains, he knew every cave, every abandoned cabin, and every secret road. In December, a very interesting story came out. A traveling priest in Virginia's Tazewell County said that two young women approached him on a road that was empty. He was ready for fights and maybe a heist. After all, stories about the Appalachian Maidens had already spread all over the area. But something very different happened. The young women only asked for food and a place to stay for one night. In exchange, they offered to help with any work that needed to be done. As a man of faith and kindness, the minister agreed. He took them to the small church where he was staying for the night. That night, while it snowed outside, the three of them talked for a long time. The pastor never talked about the whole chat, but in a sermon a few weeks later, he talked about meeting two lost souls who didn't want money or fame, just the freedom to live their own lives. What he said caused a stir. Some people from the people in the church said he was friends with criminals. Others got what he was really saying. When the priest woke up the next morning, the young women were gone. They paid with $3 in coins neatly stacked on the table and a note that said, "Thank you for your humanity." This episode taught us something important about Lillian and Grace. Not all of them were dumb monsters. They were complicated people who could be thankful and kind, but they were also set on their road and wouldn't give up no matter what. In Welch, the families of the young women were also having a rough time. After Grace's death and the public shame, her father was so upset that he closed his shop for a few weeks. He was older, quieter, and had a faraway look in his eyes when he finally opened his eyes again. Mother of Grace rarely left the house. It was terrible to feel ashamed in a small, religious town. Lillian's family had the same problems. Her brothers were always there because they worked in the mines, made fun of by their co-workers. She spent hours in church hoping for her daughter to come home, or at least for news that she was alive and safe. Her mother was very religious. Lillian's father was a tough guy who had worked underground for years and was torn between anger and a deep sadness that he could never put into words. In January 1924, something new began. A path from northeast to southwest that crossed Tennessee was the scene of several small thefts. The design is always the same: small businesses and modest. Amounts, there was no fighting, and that symbol left behind the two mountains that were tangled together. Everyone knew they were still out there, free, and fighting the system that tried to catch them. It was almost like they were signing their work. But there was more to these thefts than meets the eye. A close study of the places they picked showed an interesting trend. Lillian and Grace stayed away from family-owned businesses and poor areas. Their targets were always stores or businesses run by rich people. People who are known to abuse their workers. It seemed like they had made up their own set of rules for right and wrong. They did steal, but they picked who they stole from. In February, something happened that changed the way people thought about the two suspects. A fire broke out in an old building that was being used as an emergency home for kids in the small town of Bristol, which is right on the border between Tennessee and Virginia. It was night, and the few people who were supposed to be there were not there. A number of the people who lived there were in real danger. Two young women were seen running toward the building that was on fire. They broke down the door, went inside, and started helping people get out of the building. Everyone was saved before the building fell apart thanks to their quick actions and the actions of other neighbors who helped. The two strange women had already disappeared into the darkness by the time the volunteer firemen finally put out the fire. Since then, only when details started to get around did. The link is made by people. These were Lillian and Grace, the Appalachian crooks who were wanted by the police. But that night in Bristol, they were great. Word got around quickly, and people's views started to split more fairly for the first time since they escaped. What kind of crooks would risk their own lives to help people they don't know? The newspaper didn't know what to say about this conflict. Some people kept saying that they were dangerous to society. Some people started to wonder if there was something more going on. The Maiden Society Maid, by a journalist from Knoxville, Tennessee, was a controversial piece that said Lillian and Grace were products of a system that gave women only two choices: to submit or resist, and they had chosen to fight. Sheriff Brennan, on the other hand, wasn't interested in moral or philosophical arguments. He saw them as thieves who should be held responsible for what they did. In March 1924, he got a tip that looked good. In Knoxville, a source said they had seen the two young women working at a textile factory briefly under fake names. Brennan quickly put together his team and headed there, determined to catch the criminals who had been avoiding the law for almost 6 months. In 1924, Knoxville had about 80,000 people living in it. It was a city in transition. It was one of the most important places for business in Tennessee. Hundreds of women from rural areas came to cities to find work in textile mills, sawmills, and tobacco companies. They wanted to be financially independent. It was the best spot. Two young runaways to hide in plain sight, getting lost among all the other workers who didn't give their names. The informant said the plant was in the southern part of the city, close to the Tennessee River. It was a red brick house with tall, narrow windows that were always filled with the sound of looms. They got there early in the morning of March 12th, with 2 deputies and someone from the Knoxville Police Department. They showed pictures and written explanations to the factory. A man named Harold Simmons was his boss. Simmons carefully looked at the pictures. In fact, he knew those faces. 2 workers with the names Sarah Mills and Emma Collins, who were hired about 6 weeks ago. He said they were great workers. On time, works hard, and is quiet. They were never a problem. They stayed out of the workplace fights and talk that happened from time to time. Simmons did say that there was something about them, something in their eyes that made him think they had been through more than just simple farm life. A worker. It was an easy plan. Brennan and her team would wait until each worker left the building at the end of their shift. Then they would sneak up on them to avoid making a scene and giving them a chance to get away. At 5 p.m., when the factory whistle blew to end the shift, dozens of tired women started to leave through the main doors. They had worked non-stop for 11 hours. Brennan paid close attention to every face. He then saw them. Lillian and Grace walked along in simple skirts and scarves that covered some of their hair. We all went toward the gate together. They talked quietly and didn't seem to care. The sheriff told his men what to do, and they moved toward the young women. After that, everything changed. Grace raised her head and met Brennan's eyes. There was a brief moment of silence between them, a recognition right away. There was no word from her, she just lightly touched Lillian's arm. They both stopped walking for a split second. Then, instead of running or yelling, they turned into a side path in a calm, measured way, as if they were scared. They were just changing directions without any big deal. He ran after them, and his men were right behind him. But the alley was a maze of tiny passages between warehouses, metal stairs, stacks of boxes, and doors that led to dark warehouses. Lillian and Grace were familiar with this area. They had been there for weeks and had worked their way through every possible way to get out. Within minutes, they were no longer there at all. The search went on until it got dark. Brennan and the town's cops searched the whole area. They looked. There were boarding houses, bars, and other places where 2 young women might be hiding, but it didn't help. Lillian and Grace had once again gotten away from the law, and what was even worse was that they knew they were being actively sought after. The benefit of being surprised was gone. Brennan tried a different method over the next few days. He talked to other plant workers who knew the 2 who had run away and lived with them. A fairly complex picture of the person came out of those talks. A young woman named Margaret talked about Sarah. As nice people who had helped other new workers get used to how fast the machines worked. Dorothy, another woman, said that they often shared their food with co-workers who were hungry. An older worker called Ruth said something very interesting. She had been approached by a boss one night after work who tried to put her in awkward situations. Sarah and Emma stepped in. Even though no one was hurt, the 2 young women made it clear that this kind of behavior would not be accepted and threatened to. Report the man to the public. The boss gave up, and Ruth was never bothered by them again. Ruth said she didn't want to make things difficult for the 2 women who had helped her when she was asked why she hadn't brought it up earlier. Those stories were not at all what the wanted ads said they were. Lillian and Grace weren't just crooks running away from the law. They were people who stuck to their own morals and principles, even though they were breaking the law. They looked out for the weak and shared. That they stood up for what was right, even if it put them in danger. Brennan got angry and upset when he left Knoxville on March 20th. His motives were called into question for the first time since the chase began. Was he looking for dangerous thieves, or just trying to bring 2 young women back to a life they had fought so hard to leave? He wasn't ready to say how much the question worried him. At the same time, Lillian and Grace had moved again. Reports began to emerge from towns along the Tennessee, North, Carolina's edge. Asheville, a growing city in the Blue Ridge Mountains, seems to have been their next stop. They were used to working in coal mines and factories, but this place was different. Tourists, artists, and people from other places liked visiting Asheville. It was an easy place for two women with made-up stories to meet each other. A new letter showed up in Welch's newspaper in April 1924. This time, the tone was different. It was more thoughtful and less cocky. "We didn't ask to be born in that," the letter said. "We were not supposed to be where we were at that time or under those conditions, but we were. Since then, every choice we've made has been to become something other than what we were told we should be. You can call us criminals, but we call ourselves free. The difference is just a matter of perspective." The letter's postmark from Asheville confirmed their suspicions. But the young women were already on the run again by the time the police were called and started their search. They didn't stay long enough to be caught, but they also. They never got so alone that they lost touch with the rest of the world. They kept writing letters, leaving their mark on the story that was developing around them. Now, every week, newspapers wrote about the Appalachian Maidens. Some newspapers and magazines talked about them as a social phenomenon and what their case meant for the role of women in American society. Some people saw them as romantic symbols of rebellion, while others, especially the more conservative ones, kept saying they were just criminals who had to be punished as harshly as the law allowed. As always, the truth was most likely somewhere in the middle. In the summer of 1924, the Appalachian Mountains were very hot. Dust clouds formed over dirt roads, and rivers that cut through valleys slowed down, revealing rocks that were normally underwater. Even though it was hard to get around, a lot of people were moving around to find seasonal work on farms or in bigger cities. In this crowd of two young women could sneak past travelers without being seen more than ever before. Over the months, Lillian and Grace had formed a routine. They worked when they could, giving themselves fake names and making up stories about being orphans from a faraway city. They lived on very little money and saved every penny they could. They stayed in cheap motels when they had money and outside when they didn't. The mountains helped them by giving them shelter in natural caves and old cabins that were spread out in the more remote areas. In June, in that year, they got to a small town in North Carolina called Hot Springs. It was a spa town known for its natural hot springs, which brought in people who were sick and wanted to get better. They were used to living in industrial or rural towns, so this place felt different. There was some acceptance and welcome for people from different backgrounds. They got jobs in one of the smaller hotels where they did laundry and cleaned rooms. As the weeks went by in Hot Springs, something started to change in Olivia and Grace. It could have been the weariness they felt from being on the run for almost a year. It could have been realizing that this life, even though it was free, also had its own chains. Their freedom came from not having to live up to the expectations of the people they had left behind, but they had to hide, lie, and constantly look over their shoulders. An older woman named Josephine, who worked as a chambermaid at the hotel, became very close to the two young women. Josephine. She had her own thoughts and stories about how she got away. She had to leave a violent marriage many years ago and start over in a new place, far from everything she knew. She saw some parts of herself in the two young women. She didn't ask them dirty questions or push for information about their past. She only offered company and sometimes advice that wasn't asked for. It was Josephine who said something that Grace would always remember. She was having lunch in the back of the hotel during her break. You can run away from where you came from, but at some point you have to run towards something too. Otherwise, you're just moving around aimlessly, and that eats you up on the inside. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. The two women talked for a long time for the first time in weeks that night. They had been so focused on staying alive that they hadn't given much thought to what would happen next. Where did they go? What else did they want to build? Are they just denying what they left behind? There were no clear answers from the conversation, but it did raise some questions that would be answered in the months to come. In July, something out of the blue brought them back to the attention of the police. A businessman knew Grace from being a guest at the hotel. He had seen her picture in a newspaper months before, and even though her hair was cut shorter and her face was tanned, he was sure it was her. Instead of calling the police right away, he chose to talk to them. Directly, maybe in the hopes of getting paid for catching her. The fight happened in the hotel's tissue closet, where no one else was around, including staff and guests. Richard Blackwell, the man, blocked the door and asked if they were really the Appalachian rebels on the run. Grace was so calm that even Lillian was impressed. She didn't say anything to deny or confirm it. She only asked him what he was going to do with the information. Blackwell paused. He may have been waiting for fear, or even an attempt to bribe him. What? There were two sets of eyes staring at him, but they didn't look ashamed or hopeless. Instead, they looked tired and resigned. After that, Grace said something that caught him by surprise. "You can hand us over to the police. You have every right to do what you want, but first we want you to know that everything we did was to fight for our right to live as full people, not as property or other people's expectations. We're guilty, if that's a crime." Blackwell felt uneasy about those words because they were so honest. The man was a law and order supporter and a conservative. But he also had 2 daughters, and the way they were determined made him wonder what kind of world he was building. He didn't say anything else as he turned around and left the warehouse after a long pause. Even though he never told anyone what he saw, it was clear that Hot Springs was no longer safe. That same night, Lillian and Grace left, taking only a few things with them and a few dollars they owed in pay. The next morning, Josephine found a short note. "You helped us remember that we need to run towards something. We're still not sure what love and gratitude mean." They went west and crossed the Great Smoky Mountains to get back to Tennessee. They had been there before, but this time they had a clearer idea of where they wanted to go. They knew that some parts of the South were becoming experimental communities where people who didn't fit traditional norms could live more freely, without any restrictions. Some people thought this might be true, but it was the first time in months that they had a plan for the long run. It was hard to get through the Great Smoky Mountains. There are steep roads, weather that changes quickly, and wild animals that are always a threat. On the other hand, those old mountains had a wild beauty that moved the 2 young women deeply. They were born in the mountains and grew up breathing air that was high up. The mountains were in even though they had left their home country, their blood. They had time to think about everything that had happened since the night they left Welch in September during the crossing, which took almost 2 weeks. They had made it through a hard winter. They had gotten away from arrest more than once. They had robbed, worked, helped people, and saved lives. They were now myths, symbols, and whispered about stories. But more than that, they had shown themselves that they could live beyond the limits that were put on them at birth. In August 1924, in the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee, there's a small town called Crossville where Lillian and Grace live. It was an old, forgotten spot where 2 dirt roads met, giving people going in all directions a place to stop and start their journey. There were fewer than 1,000 people living in the town, but it had one interesting trait. People who didn't want to know too much about other people's pasts liked living there. They met a man named Samuel Webb there. He owned a small gas station and car repair shop. Samuel was. He was 43 years old, had been widowed, and was known for doing honest work for anyone who needed it without asking for names or long histories. If Lillian and Grace came to look for work, he only asked them if they knew how to work hard. It was enough to answer yes. For a few weeks, the two young women pumped gas, cleaned the gas station, and helped with the simple shop chores. Samuel didn't say much, but he was aware of things. He saw that they always stayed alert whenever a government car went by. It was noted how they didn't have deep talks with customers. He saw that they kept looking at the mountains around them as if they were planning ways to get away. As Samuel worked on the engine of an old truck one afternoon, he said, "You know, I don't read many newspapers. I think people's pasts are their business, not mine. What interests me is whether someone does a good job in the present." It was a simple statement, but it was clear what he meant. Samuel knew at the very least. They knew who they were, but he said he didn't care. That small act of trust made a big difference in the lives of both young women. They began to calm down for the first time in almost a year. Not fully, never fully, but enough to sleep a few extra hours every night. Enough to talk to people from other places without worrying that you might be found out at any time. There was something interesting about Crossville. Some people decided to stay because it was a place where people went and came. It has a respectful environment of anonymity. Someone who used to be in the army never talked about it. A woman who ran a small boarding house and was obviously lying about her own life. A doctor who lost his license in another state for no clear reason but still helped people in the community when they needed it. There were people in the town who had chosen to be alone and were hiding secrets. This is where Lillian and Grace first started to think about a life besides always being on the run. How about if they could just stay? What if this place, with its safe silence and questions that aren't asked, was really close to home? The urge to give in was real and strong. They were worn out, sick of having to run, lie down, and sleep with one eye open. People outside of them hadn't forgotten about them, though. Someone from the federal government came to Crossville in September. His name was Douglas Whitmore, and even though his last name was the same as Grace's, he was not related to her. Whitmore was following a tip that had to do with bootleggers who work in the area. But as part of his job, he also looked at those signs in every town he went to. He went to Samuel's gas station to fill up his work car. It was Grace who helped him, and her face was partly covered by her wide-brimmed hat. Whitmore was polite and quick, but he wasn't very good at noticing small things. He paid for the gas, said thank you, and then he drove off. Grace let out a sigh of relief because she thought they had just gotten out of another possibly dangerous situation. What? What she didn't know was that the marshal had left something behind. Whitmore forgot to put a folder of papers in the back seat of his car because he was in a hurry. When he quickly left, the folder fell to the ground next to the gas pump. After a few minutes, Samuel found it and looked inside without thinking about what to do with it. Reports, warrants, and a bunch of wanted pictures were in the folder. There were pictures of Lillian May Hartley among papers about drug dealers and bank thieves. Grace Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas. They were from family portraits and were almost a year old, but they were still identifiable. There was a full description and the word "wanted" in big letters under each picture. That was a slow end for Samuel. One look took him to Lillian's studio, where she was working on something. The next look was to Grace, who was still near the bombs. This finding had a huge amount of weight. He had knowledge that could stop the two young women from getting away. One easy thing, one phone call would end it all. Because of what they did, they would be jailed, taken back to West Virginia, and have to deal with the results. But Samuel wasn't the type of person to act without thinking. He put the folder away in his office and thought about things all day. He watched the two young women work and noticed how hard they worked at even the smallest jobs. He also remembered the talks they had been having over the past few weeks. He was sure that they were good people who had made bad decisions in bad times. A situation. Samuel called them into his small office in the back of the station as the sun was going down. When they saw the folder on the table, their hearts almost stopped. At first, he didn't say anything. He just let them see and know that their secret had been found. After that, there was a heavy silence like lead. Samuel finally spoke. "The officer will come back tomorrow morning to look for this. Then you can choose what you want to do. You can leave now to get an extra few hours of sleep, or you can stay and trust me to return this folder," he said. "I found it in the dust after he left and didn't look too closely at what was inside." He paused. "But I want you to know that if you stay, someone will finally figure out who you are. It might happen tomorrow. It might be in 6 months. People in a small town can't keep a secret like that for long." Grace and Lillian looked at each other. It was not possible to make that choice. Leaving meant going back to the road, to never-ending doubt, and to the weariness of never having a place anywhere. There was danger in staying, but there was also the chance of a normal life, even if it was only for a short time. They asked for the night to think, and Samuel gave them permission. He locked the bag in a drawer and told them it would be safe until the next morning. That night, the two young women talked quietly as they walked through Crossville's empty streets. They had been through and lived through a lot. On the other hand, they weren't running away from anything specific this time. They had to choose what to run away from. It was the choice they made that scared them more than any chase. Dawn came without Lillian and Grace having slept at all. In the dark hours, they sat on a small rocky outcropping on the edge of Crossville and watched the stars slowly move across the Appalachian sky. They had seen the same sky their whole lives. Their grandparents and great-grandparents had used the same constellations to find their way through those mountains. There was something comfortable and sad about the sense of continuity. They made up their minds before the first orange and pink rays of sunshine hit the horizon. They went back to the gas station before Samuel got there to open the door. Their few things were put into 2 worn-out backpacks, and they sat on the front steps. Samuel didn't have to ask when he showed up around 6 a.m. They looked like they knew the answer. It was simple. "We're leaving," Grace said. "We want to thank you for your work, your faith, and most of all for giving us." A choice instead of just giving up, Lillian agreed. Her eyes were red from tiredness, but she stood tall and looked serious. Samuel slowly nodded, went into the office, and came back with an envelope. They got paid, plus a little extra for the road, he told Grace when she tried to refuse the extra money. Finally, Samuel went away again and came back with a map of the area that had some pencil marks on it. He pointed out these towns or villages where people like me live. Don't ask anything. They might not always be safe, but they're good places to start. It was a gift that was worth much more than cash. They walked west on the muddy road out of Crossville while the town was still waking up. Marshal Whitmore would come get his briefcase in a few hours, and Samuel would keep his word by returning the paper and acting like he didn't know what was inside it. Lillian and Grace were moving again, but this time they had something new with them. They had a map to the future and proof that people were still willing to help them. The next few months were full of people coming and going. They followed Samuel's map through small towns in Tennessee and Kentucky, working wherever they could. They stayed long enough to get stronger, but never long enough to plant roots. Everywhere they went, they heard different versions of what Samuel had said. Real work, no questions asked, and an unseen network of people living on the edges of society as it is now. It was October 1924 when they got to a very strange town near Berea, Kentucky. It was an agricultural cooperative started by people who didn't want to live in big towns and instead wanted a simpler, more communal life. They had heard about experimental villages months before, but this wasn't quite the same. People there worked together, shared the harvest, and made choices as a group. Most importantly, they didn't judge each other's pasts. It was What Lillian and Grace found there was something they hadn't expected. Other women with stories like yours. A woman named Catherine ran away from an Ohio marriage that had been set up. Because she didn't want to get married, another Rebecca ran away from her family, who wanted to put her in a care home. Older people, like Martha and Louise, had lived together for decades and had found acceptance in that society that they could never find in the outside world. They saw each other for the first time since they left Welch. Grace didn't feel so alone. There were other people like them who had taken a tough path to find something more real. There were other people ready to pay for freedom as well. During their weeks in Berea, they helped with the harvest, made jams and jellies for the winter, and spoke at community meetings where everyone, no matter their background or gender, had a chance to be heard. The older woman, Martha, told her story one night around the campfire. She was 64 years old now, had lived with Louise for more than 40 of them. Her voice was rough but firm as she spoke. "People think choices like ours are easy," she said. "They believe it's only about bravery, but it's not. People told you that you should want certain things, but you have to be ready to give them up in order to get yourself. You'll sometimes wonder if it was all worth it. When things like that happen, know that the other option was to die while you were still alive." Lillian and Grace kept hearing Martha's words for days. They had been so focused on staying alive that they hadn't given much thought to what their choices really meant. They hadn't stolen anything and ran away just to get money or have fun. It was deeply offensive to them to think that their lives should be planned by other people. They did something political, even though they hadn't thought of it that way. In November, it got really cold for the first time this season. The fields turned brown and still, and the trees lost their leaves. The neighborhood. Get ready for a winter with less work that needs to be done. Lillian and Grace had to make a choice. Could they spend the winter there? They were asked by the community. It would be safe, pretty nice, and give them a few months of real rest, but they would have to stay in one place for a long time, which always raises the risk of being found. It was during one of these talks that shocking news came in. Her traveler, who was going through the area, said that they saw new signs being put up in a number of places, U.S. towns in Tennessee and Kentucky. The posters still showed Lillian and Grace, but there was one important change. The reward had been greatly raised. Someone put down $500 for each of them to be caught. It was probably Grace's family or a group of traders who had lost money in the thefts. A total of $1,000 was a lot of money that could change the life of any farmhand. Everything changed when the prize went up. For those who might have ignored it before, it meant they might want to pay more attention now. It meant after months of mostly quiet, the hunt had gotten worse. Catherine, the woman who ran away from her forced marriage, said what everyone was thinking. You can't trust anyone you don't know very well with that much money. Still, when that much money is at stake, people change. There was no doubt that she was right. Even though the town was friendly, they couldn't stay there because it could put everyone in danger. If the authorities found them, they might cause trouble for the whole cooperative. Asking them why they had taken in wanted criminals. It wasn't fair to the kind people who had helped them out. This was Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 1924. In the morning of that day, Lillian and Grace got ready to leave again. The group threw a small party to say goodbye and shared the food and supplies they had. Martha and Louise held the two girls close for a long time. Martha told Grace something she would never forget. Don't stop until you find a good spot to do so. Put in all of your effort to get it. From the start of their escape until the end, the winter of 1924-1925 was the worst Lillian and Grace had ever seen. There was a lot of snow on the slopes, and the temperatures dropped so low that every day was a fight to stay alive. They moved slowly through Kentucky on their way south, where they hoped it would be warmer and there would be fewer police watching them. They learned to depend on the kindness of strangers in ways they never thought possible during those cold months. An English farming family gave them a place to stay for 3 nights during a very bad snowstorm. In Albany, a blacksmith gave away his hot forge and a bowl of soup without being asked. In Monticello, a widow offered short-term work to take care of her chickens in exchange for a small room in the barn. While these actions may not seem like much, they were very important that harsh winter. But not every meeting was a good one. During a trip in January 1925 through a remote area close to the Tennessee line, 2 guys came up to them and said they recognized them from the wanted posters. The men blocked both exits on a narrow bridge over a partly frozen creek and tried to corner them. One of them, a big guy with a scraggly beard, smiled and said that they were going to take them to the nearest sheriff to get the reward. What came next showed how much Lillian and Grace had changed in the 15 months they were running away. There was no longer any doubt or fear that stopped them. Grace reached into her coat without a fuss. She kept the gun they had taken the night they escaped in her pocket. She didn't draw it. She just made the movement clear enough for the guys to see that they were armed. Lillian, on the other hand, set herself up so she could easily get away if she had to. "You can try to take us," Grace said firmly, "but you have to ask yourself if $1,000 is worth the risk. We don't want to hurt anyone, but we're not going back to prison either. The choice is yours." Men took a moment to think about what was making her voice sound so sure and how determined the 2 young women looked. They were used to seeing people who were scared and sad. They were not expecting such a strong sense of calm. After a nervous moment that seemed to last forever, the second man, who was thinner and seemed less sure of himself than the first man, said something about not being worth the trouble. The 2 men slowly walked away, still looking back every once in a while, but it was clear they didn't want to risk a fight. Lillian and Grace waited until they were completely out of sight before moving on. Their hearts were racing, but they kept the calm faces they had learned to show. The event in question was a major turning point. It dawned on them that their image went beyond the crimes they had committed. The stories about the Appalachian Maidens had changed and grown over time. Some people thought they were scary killers with guns. Some people saw them as fighting for a bigger cause. It was more of the truth. Every day, the 2 young women were just trying to stay alive and keep their freedom. They were ready to do anything, but they hoped they would never have to use violence. In February, they were close to Nashville, Tennessee. Their comfort zone was too big of a city, but it had something that smaller towns couldn't: anonymity by way of number. In a city with more than 100,000 people, 2 young women could easily get lost among the workers, immigrants and tourists who are always coming and going. They got a job at an industrial laundry that cleaned for a number of hotels in downtown. Working 12-hour shifts in hot, sticky conditions was hard, but the pay was good, and you didn't need to give specific references. Frau Schneider, the owner of the laundry, was born in Germany and moved to the United States as an immigrant. She knew intuitively that some of her workers had come from hard places. Nashville also gave Lillian and Grace ideas they had never heard before. There were more and more activists, union leaders, and progressive thinkers living in the city. People got together in small rooms to talk about worker rights, women's right to vote, and social change. When Grace heard about one of these talks, she persuaded Lillian to go because she was interested. It was an event that opened my eyes. They heard their own anger and frustrations put into political and philosophical words for the first time. One speaker was Lillian, a woman in her 30s. Parsons talked about how society structures kept women in set roles and didn't let them make their own decisions about their lives. She talked about fighting back, about the need to question unfair rules, and about everyone's basic right to choose their own fate. Lillian saw the two young women who had stayed in the back of the room and listened carefully but didn't take part in the talks after the meeting. I went up to her and started talking to her. Grace and Lillian were careful. They didn't say much about themselves, but Lillian could tell. "You're not just here for intellectual reasons," she said. "You've been through something that brought you here. I don't need to know what it is, but if you ever want to turn personal experience into collective action, that's fine too." The offer was appealing. For the first time, there was a chance to give their experiences more meaning and change their personal lives. But it was also risky. Joining political movements meant being seen, heard, and remembered. And for two people on the run with a $1,000 reward on their heads, remaining invisible was still their best defense. Over the next few weeks in Nashville, Lillian and Grace went to a few more meetings, always keeping a safe distance and listening to the ideas, arguments, and plans that were being talked about. They started to understand that their own story was connected to the bigger picture. They weren't just two rebellious young women. They were part of a larger social change in which women from all walks of life were starting to question and challenge the limits that were put on them. But Nashville, like every other place before it, couldn't be a permanent home. In March, there was a major police operation in the city that was targeting bootleggers. The operation itself had nothing to do with them, but the fact that there were more police on the streets made them feel safer. Everything was riskier on the streets. Any document check or overly cautious look from an officer could end their escape. But there was something else going on inside them both. After a year and a half of living as fugitives, always on the move and always looking over their shoulders, they were both physically and mentally worn out. They were tired of never being able to just exist without weighing risks, making up stories, or they always had to keep secrets from each other. One night, in the small room they shared in a cheap boarding house, they finally talked about something that had been on their minds for too long. "How much longer can we go on like this? How much longer do we run?" Lillian asked, her voice showing a weakness she didn't show very often. "Is there a way out of this besides being caught or killed?" Grace didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the city lights and thought of all the places they'd been to. It was spring in the Appalachian Mountains, and there were lots of wildflowers. Lillian and Grace had left Nashville and were heading back to the Highlands, the place they knew. "Maybe the mistake is thinking there has to be an ending," she finally said. "Maybe this is just what our lives are now." They were always moving, and their freedom came with constant instability. It wasn't what they had hoped for, but it was better than the alternative. They felt like they had to go back to the mountains, even if it wasn't quite home, because of all the places they had been traveling to. They temporarily lived in a remote area near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which was still in its early stages. There were not many people there, and a few mountain families were still living the way their ancestors had for generations. It was a place where the federal government had not yet set up a home. There wasn't much government there. Laws were more like suggestions than hard and fast rules, and privacy was a basic value. It was in an abandoned cabin that Lillian and Grace found and fixed up that they finally had time to think about everything they had done in the 18 months since they left Welch in September. 18 months of hard work, close calls, unexpected encounters, and learning about the world in a way that school could not have taught them. They lived in 6 states, worked 12 different jobs, and changed a lot of people's lives along the way. One April afternoon, as they fixed the roof of the cabin, Grace said something she had been thinking about for weeks. "Have you noticed that we never really talk about what comes next?" From the start, it had been all about running away and making it through the next day or week. But what about after that? Is there an afterward for us? Lillian stopped working and looked out at the mountains in every direction. Lillian slowly replied, I used to think freedom meant being able to go anywhere. But now I know that freedom can also mean being able to stay somewhere, to pick a spot and say, "This is my home." Not because someone told me it should be, but because I chose it. It was a simple but profound realization. After all the moving and flying, they wanted to be still and arrive, but their situation didn't allow for either. They weren't being romantic. They were still wanted, and there was reward money for their capture. And while this remote area made them feel like they were mostly alone, eventually someone would pass through and ask questions. The illusion of permanence they were starting to build was just that, an illusion. In May, this reality hit them hard when a group of prospectors came to the area looking for possible mineral deposits in the mountains. One of them was a man. He had worked in the McDowell County mines many years before and didn't recognize Lillian at first, but something about her looked like it brought back memories. That night, as he sat around the campfire with his friends, he realized it was Lillian Hartley, the young woman who had run away almost 2 years before. The prospector, James Ridley, had to make a choice. $1,000 was more money than he could earn in 5 years of hard work. But he remembered Lillian as a girl before she was old enough to work, and he remembered how the mines had destroyed her family of honest people. Forcibly bringing back a young woman who had clearly chosen a different life, even if it was illegal, was very upsetting to him. Ridley made a choice that would surprise even himself. The next morning, he walked to the cabin where Lillian and Grace were staying. As soon as Lillian answered the door and recognized him, fear filled her eyes. But Ridley quickly raised his hands in peace. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said. "I came to warn you that my companions haven't recognized you yet, but they will eventually. You have maybe a day or two at most before someone makes the connection and decides the reward is worth the trip to the nearest sheriff." Lillian called Grace, and the three of them talked briefly on the phone. Ridley confirmed that he had seen them, that the reward was still valid, and that he had no plans to report them himself, but he couldn't promise that his friends would not either. "You've built something here," he said, pointing to the fixed-up cabin and the small garden they'd started. "It's a shame to leave, but if you stay, you'll lose so much more than that." After Ridley left, Lillian and Grace sat in silence for a while. They had only been here for 6 weeks, but they were already starting to see it as a permanent home. They had plans to make the garden bigger, maybe get some chickens, and make something that looked like a sustainable life. They knew it was naive, but they needed to dream these hopes to stay alive. That night, they repacked their few belongings. It was becoming a sad and familiar ritual. With each place they left behind, they left a piece of themselves. They left before dawn, following trails that were only known to the most experienced mountaineers. This time, though, they didn't have a clear goal in mind. Samuel's map had been helpful, but the places he had marked as safe were no longer safe. Many of them had probably already heard about the bigger reward. The informal network of help they had found was closing down. As the stakes on their heads went up, they became less reliable. For the next few weeks, they wandered through the most remote parts of the mountains, staying away from towns and even small villages. They survived by fishing, gathering wild plants they had known since childhood, and sometimes stealing from empty huts when they had no other choice. It was a dangerous life, more like that of animals trapped in a corner than that of people living full lives. Grace got sick while they were desperately wandering. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away and then turned into a fever. The harsh conditions they were living in out in the elements, not getting enough food, and being under constant stress finally caught up with them. Lillian was scared. They were far from any medical help, and going to get it would put them at risk of being caught. But leaving Grace untreated could lead to something much worse. Lillian made a choice. It was only possible for her to carry Grace on her back because they had both lost a lot of weight during those months of not eating. They walked through the mountains for 8 hours until they reached a small town called Cosby, Tennessee. It was a huge risk, but they had no choice. When they got there at dawn, Lillian knocked on the door of the first house she saw that had a light on. Abigail Morrison, who was 76 years old, answered the door. Had worked as a midwife and healer in that area for more than 50 years. When 2 sick and tired young women knocked on her door, she let them in without asking who they were or where they were from. "Questions can wait," she said in a strong but gentle voice. Abigail Morrison turned Grace's small guest room into a fake hospital because she said, "Healing cannot." The girl's fever got worse on the walk, and now she was switching between both sanity and madness. Lillian stayed by her side the whole time, putting cool cloths on her face, holding her hand during her shaking, and whispering encouraging words when Grace woke up for a moment and didn't seem to know where she was. The old doctor worked quickly and well because he had been doing it for a long time. She made teas with herbs from her own yard, put picuses on Grace's chest to help her breathe, and gave her willow bark tincture to bring down her fever. The result stayed the same for 3 days and nights. Not sure. Abigail told them that Grace had pneumonia, which was a disease that killed a lot of people at that time, especially those who had been sick for months. Lillian didn't get much sleep during those painful days. She talked to the old woman while she worked and helped Abigail with the care. She also got water from the well and kept the fire going. There was no straight question from Abigail as to who they were or why 2 young women in such a bad mood showed up at her door. She did, however, tell her own stories. They held hidden lessons and the knowledge that comes from living a long and difficult life. Abigail said one night as she made more healing tea, "I had a daughter once. Like you two, she had a wild spirit. The world tried to put limits on her, but she wouldn't give in. She wanted to learn, see the world, and live a life bigger than these mountains. She left when she was 20. She didn't come back." There was a long pause. "I never found out if she did, but I decided to believe she did. I think she did. Even though it cost me a lot to have her around, I decided to think that her bravery was worth it." Grace's fever finally went away in the morning of the 4th day. She was weak when she woke up, but she was able to remember Lillian and the room she was in. The tears of happiness that fell from Lillian's eyes were the first ones she had shed since they left Welch almost 2 years ago. All the stress, fear, and tiredness she had been holding back for a while finally came to the surface. Let go in those quiet tears. It took Grace 2 more weeks to get strong enough to walk without help. While Abigail was getting better, her small house became a safe place like nowhere else. It was regular, predictable, and there was real care. When she helped the 2 young women, the old healer was strong like a mother, but also let them make their own decisions. She never made them stay longer than they had to, but she also never told them to leave. During her 3rd week at Cosby, Lillian finally made up her mind to tell Abigail the truth. The story was told to Grace by Lillian while the other 2 women worked in the garden in the afternoon. Welch's escape, the thefts, the constant chase, and the $1,000 prize. She said she was tired, didn't know what to do next, and was afraid that everything would end badly in some way. Abigail did not speak while she listened. Her aged hands kept working the ground as she took in every word. There was a long after Lillian was done. The only sound that broke the quiet was birds singing in the trees nearby. The old woman finally spoke. "You believe you can't keep running, but you also believe you can't turn back into the person you were before. So, the real question isn't where to run, but how to live in a way that fits who you've become." "However," Lillian asked, her voice rough from anger and despair, "how do we live when people want us, when everywhere we go gets dangerous at some point? We can't use our own names or tell our own stories and can't just exist? Their replies were not simple, and they both knew it. Abigail put down her work and looked at Lillian straight on. I don't know the answer, but I do know that in this big country, there are places where people can go away and start over. In big towns, no one knows who lives next door. Frontiers far away, where the present is more important than the past. You're still young. You still have time to start over, even if it's not the life you had planned. Thought of. After a pause, she added, You can also stop running and face what you left behind. I'm not sure what would happen, but at least there would be an answer. Lillian and Grace hadn't really thought about the idea of stopping running, of coming back on their own, and having to deal with the results of their actions. They always seemed to have a good reason to keep running: the fear of being caught, judged, or pushed back into the lives they had left behind. But after 2 years of being tired and not knowing what would happen, the idea of a fix, even if it hurt, was appealing. When Grace felt well enough that night to have a long chat, Lillian told Grace everything she had talked about with Abigail. They talked late into the night, weighing impossible choices and picturing different worlds as they tried to figure out which path would give them more than just a chance to stay alive. They could go west, maybe to California, where they said it didn't matter as much what people did in the past. They were able to. Try to settle down in a big city like New York or Chicago and get lost in the crowds of people. They could either go back on their own, face justice, and hope for some forgiveness, given the reasons they ran away in the first place. That didn't seem like a good choice. Each choice came with its own risks and costs, but for the first time, they weren't just responding to what the world threw at them. They were trying to make a choice. It scared me, but there was also something. There was something freeing about taking charge of their own lives, even when the choices were tough. As Grace got stronger over the next few days, they carefully thought about all of their options. She didn't give them straight advice, but she did ask them questions that made them really think about what they wanted. Not just freedom from jail, but what kind of freedom? What kind of life would be worth giving up everything they had? What kind of future would make up for all the pain in the past? Grace was the one who, finally, put into words how they were both feeling. We left because we didn't want to live the lives that were being forced on us. But at some point, we stopped making plans for a different life and just avoided the results. That's not having freedom. It's just a different jail. It hurt, but it was a terrible truth. They were free from something, but they weren't really free for anything. Early in June 1925, almost 2 years after their first escape, Lillian and Grace, an answer that would even surprise them. They were going to write her a letter in Welsh. They didn't send one of the angry notes they had sent before. This time, it was a proposal. They agreed to go back and face the charges against them, but only if certain things were done. They wanted to know that they would be treated fairly. It was important to them to be able to tell their own story. The people who fled wanted the court to look into what happened that made them run away in the first place. It was a huge risk. There was no promise that the sheriff would agree to talk things out or keep any promises they make. They could just go back and be punished by the law in a harsh way. But they were different after those weeks in Cosby. From what they saw in the future, they knew that running forever wasn't really living. They were just putting off what was going to happen and losing more and more of who they were in the process. Abigail offered to send the letter through a trusted third party to make sure it got to its destination without letting them know who they were. Address. It could take weeks for them to get an answer, so Lillian and Grace stayed in the small house in Cosby. They worked in the yard, helped Abigail with her occasional lack of patience, and for the first time in a long time, they just existed without having to worry about flying all the time. Lillian and Grace had some of the strangest weeks of their lives while they were waiting for Sheriff Brennan to answer. They weren't actively running away or figuring out what to do next. They were stuck between the past they had left behind and a future they didn't know anything about. It was both freeing and scary at the same time. During that time, people in the small town of Cosby slowly learned that the two young women were staying at Abigail's house. People there respected the old healer's privacy and decisions because she had a good name. She had to have a good reason for taking in two strangers if she did. Some people were interested, some people were not interested, but no one was rude or asked too many questions. At this point in time, Lillian and Grace had a rare chance to just live their normal lives. They went to neighborhood events once in a while, helped neighbors with chores when they needed it, and took part in daily life in a way they hadn't been able to do in almost 2 years. Even though they were always careful, there were times when they forgot they were wanted criminals with a $1,000 reward on their heads. Heads, Sheriff Brennan's answer came in late June. The tone of the letter was surprisingly polite, and it told them something they didn't expect. Brennan was also worn out. He chased two young women across several states for 2 years, using resources that the county couldn't afford and becoming a supporting figure in a story that seemed bigger than anyone. He was ready to talk things over. Brennan's idea was easy to understand. If they came back on their own and gave back he would directly ask the judge to be lenient with the stolen money plus a rough interest. He couldn't promise what would happen, but he would do everything he could to make sure they got the least amount of time in jail possible. They could have kept running away, knowing that they would eventually be caught and have to face the full force of the law, which wouldn't have cared about their special circumstances. It had to do with money. Not much of the original $840 was left. They had lived for months on that money, and even, after being careful, they were able to stay alive. While odd jobs helped, they were never enough to get back what they had spent. They wouldn't even be able to get close to the original amount of money with the interest added on top of that. Abigail came up with an answer that no one expected. She had saved a small amount of money over many years of working as a doctor. She told them she would lend them the money to make up the gap. "You can pay me back over the years," she said simply, "or you can't. Either way, I'd rather my money help two young women rebuild their lives than sit around until I die, being fought over by distant relatives who never cared about me." The generosity was overwhelming. Lillian and Grace tried to refuse, arguing that they had already received too much from Abigail to accept such a sacrifice, but the old healer was as stubborn as they were. "Let an old woman feel like she made a difference," she insisted. "Let me believe I helped. Have the chance that my daughter looked for and might not have found. Just asking isn't enough." At the beginning of July 1925, Lillian and Grace left Cosby for Welch after weeks of getting ready emotionally. Abigail went with them to the Newport train stop, which was the closest one. Their goodbye was filled with sadness. The old woman gave each of them a tight hug and whispered encouraging words. She told him, "You are stronger than you think. You've shown it for 2 years, now show it by. Be as brave as ever as you face what comes next." The train ride back to West Virginia was strange. They went through many of the same places they had seen on their escape, but this time they were going the other way. Every place the train went through made me think of old times. They had been working there for a while. In this place, they had just barely avoided being seen. This was the area where snow almost killed them. It was like going through a picture album of a life that was impossible and amazing. When? Last but not least, on July 10th, they got to Welch. As promised, Sheriff Brennan was waiting at the station. That picture of him made him look younger and less tired, but as he watched them get off the train, his eyes were kind. There were no bonds or big show for everyone. He just met them politely and led them to the sheriff's office without drawing attention to himself. After that, the court process took a long time and was hard to understand. There were depositions, meetings, and talks between lawyers. The story of Lillian and Grace was finally told in. The whole thing. Not only the specifics of the thefts and the escape, but also the background that led to them. The harsh rules that young women had to follow at that time and place. The despair of lives that were set in stone and gave people no choice or control, and the sheer bravery it took to reject it all. A lot of people were interested in the hearing when it finally happened in September. Reporters from as far away as Charleston and Richmond were there to cover the story. The press had called them Appalachian Maidens, and they became. They were signs of something bigger than the crimes they committed. Some saw them as thieves who should be punished. For some, they were trailblazers who stood up to unfair rules and were punished for being brave. Harold Montgomery, the 68-year-old judge, listened to all the reasons before giving his sentence. He agreed that the acts were very bad and that someone had to pay for them. But he also recognized the unusual circumstances, like the fact that they had come back on their own when they could. They were still on the run and had given back the money that they stole. He got 1 year in jail for each, but he could get out after 6 months of good behavior. Though longer than planned, it wasn't as long as they were afraid it would be. Most importantly, there was a clear end. No more flying in the dark all the time. No more feeling like you don't fit anywhere. After 6 months or a year, they could start making their real lives, complete with real names and stories. These people, Lillian and Grace, did their time in the county jail. It was hard. Prison is never. They knew it was only for a short time because they had each other. They got letters from people they had met along the way during those months. Samuel from Crossville wrote to say that he was still thinking about them and hoped they were at peace. Martha and Louise from the Berea group sent them encouraging letters, and Abigail wrote to them every week to tell them about Cosby and invite them to come back when they got out. They were let go in March of 1926, after having served for exactly 6 months. When they got out of jail, it was cold and clear, and the sun was rising over the Appalachian Mountains, which had seen them the whole way. They were 20 years old now. They had wasted almost 3 years of their lives on this crazy journey. But they had also gained something very valuable, the knowledge that they could choose their own paths, no matter how hard the results would be. They didn't go back to Welch. They only had memories and hopes to hold on to there. They could never meet. Instead, they took the train back to Cosby, where Abigail was waiting for them with her small but friendly house, her garden of healing herbs, and her open arms. They finally found the place where they could start building the life they had been racing to find. It wasn't easy in the years that followed. They're never that. But they were theirs. Asked for their own names and lived their own lives without constantly being watched. Lillian and Grace joined the Cosby community and worked, gave back, living. People in the area finally made up stories about the 2 young women who dared to be different and lived to tell the tale. Now, we'll end this trip by talking about one of the strangest cases that the Appalachians have ever seen. The story of Lillian and Grace shows us that freedom is not free. What you really want always costs something, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not run away, but stop running and face what comes next. If this story moved you in any. Also, if you stuck with us until the end, please think about becoming a channel subscriber. If you liked meeting the Appalachian Maidens, please like this movie. What do you think? Did you think Lillian and Grace were bad people who should have been punished? Or did you think they were pioneers who just happened to be born at the wrong time? History isn't always that easy, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Until then, take a trip through the scary and dark secrets of our past.